And I'm also going to go to share screen, and we're going to bring up the lesson itself. And so we're going to go through this. And again, we're going to talk through the lesson, talk a little bit through our thought process here. Nancy's going to speak to a lot of the ways that she thinks that this can be very practically put into place in the classroom and turnkey to students. The one thing I do want to draw all of your attention to, though, is we do have this area in yellow right here. I would not call it a disclaimer because we do feel very passionately about what we created here. But we also really want to think about the times that we're living in and how they're impacting students very differently. And so, issues of childhood trauma, the idea of the fact that this could generate feelings of PTSD for students, students are experiencing very real loss is something that we all have to acknowledge and we all have to kind of center our work around. And so as we engage in this, these are resources to use. They certainly can be modified or adapted any way that you want to do that. But we certainly want to be very cognizant and aware of how our children are being hit by this. So I'm just going to read this to you. And if there are any thoughts or questions based on that before we jump in, please feel free to raise your hand and we can address those. So as social studies teachers, we know that connecting students to current events is critical. Developmentally, many 6th, 7th, and 8th graders are able to access information related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but may lack the context and lenses to put the information they are consuming into perspective. Students may also be experiencing trauma and loss due to family, friend, and community illnesses or death. Giving students factual information and providing a space for them to share their thoughts and concerns in a supportive and structured environment is critical. And for our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, they are certainly taking this information in. They're having wonderings, they're confused, they're trying to make sense of it. I had demo lessoned one of our earlier lessons with 2nd graders, and even the 2nd graders, and this was weeks and weeks and weeks ago, all they wanted to do was talk about COVID-19 and how it was impacting them. So we can imagine for our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders who are, much more developmentally along, they have questions and they may not necessarily have a space where they can ask or frame those questions. We've included multiple resources to assist in unpacking our experiences with students during these challenging times. We ourselves are having experiences. We're suffering from trauma. This is a social emotional learning event for everyone involved. And so we also have to work through our feelings, and we're here to support you in that as well. Please also check with your district for guidance in connecting with students about the COVID-19 pandemic, because again, we want to do this in a responsible way that centers their feelings, centers their social, emotional, and mental health needs, and again, is respectful to the fact that we're all having diverse experiences here. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Nancy, before we continue on? Okay. And Nancy, I'm just going to keep you unmuted just so you can pop in.
Okay, great.
At any time.
No, there isn't anything else I want to add other than this is technical, Greg. I'm looking and every now and then I see the chat blink, but since the lesson is up, I'm not sure. Are we going to see their chat conversations along the side anyway?
It should pop up also. It should pop up also. But we're going to do our best monitoring it. And even if we have to loop around at the end, that's fine. We're going to, again, try to go through this pretty quickly,
Okay.
everyone, just so that we can leave space at the end where we can just discuss this. Or if you have other thoughts or wonderings or concerns, I mean, again, this is an open forum for 6th through 8 social studies teachers, but any social studies teacher who also wants to share thoughts or concerns or even resources that you've been using. Again, it's just greatly appreciated because it's the collective, background of all of us that's going to make this work for our kids.
So one of the things you'll notice is that this lesson is constructed a bit more loosely than some of the other lessons we've created. And we did that intentionally when we wanted to ground it and be sure that whatever discussion we had in COVID was actually tied to the New York State framework. So in that document that I sort of summarized what I'm going to say right now, there is a connection. For example, in grade 6, it specifically draws on that unit 6.7, where we talk about the beginning of global trade and we talk about the plague. And then in grade 7, we talk about the encounter between the Spanish and the Native Americans. And then there's also a document in there that deals with Washington inoculating the troops. Ironically, before the smallpox vaccination was widely tested, and he's quite somewhat credited with saving the health of the troops by this order and having a better outcome for the revolution. And then grade 8, there were multiple. There was the 7th and 8th, the tension between states and federal government, the risks of global trade, the interaction of migrations that have occurred in our country throughout history. So there were so many historic examples. Ironically, we included documents on the plague of 1918. That is not actually spelled out in the 8th grade framework. However, there's this allusion to how life has changed as a result of the war. So it tangentially occurs, but it is so frequently compared to today's outbreak and some of the behaviors we see that we thought it was important enough to put that in there. So if you are concerned about the emotional conversation of coronavirus, you may feel more comfortable sticking pretty close to content as opposed to moving on to the bigger themes of the virus right now. But it's set up so you can move in multiple ways. Do you have any questions before I sort of go on? Okay.
I think we're good, Nancy. And what I'll do is maybe I'm going to actually scroll down and we can just talk very briefly to each of those things.
Okay.
But I think, go ahead.
Are you going to scroll?
I'll scroll.
Seem to be able to. Okay.
I'm scrolling.
So this is filled with a variety of skill exercises or the practices. It focuses on practices such as sourcing, gathering evidence. There's a lot to do with analyzing visuals. Initially, that was what we were going to do, was make the whole lesson visual, but then we thought the kids needed text to give them some context for some of the things that were happening. It draws on map interpretation skills and graph interpretation. So that's another way that you may want to approach this, is pull out some of the documents individually and just deal with skill development. Or you may have students that need you to spend a little more time on that. At the same time, this can be used to build claims and do writing with students.
And that's what you'll see on the screen right here. So we worked with Danielle Colangelo, who's my ELA counterpart. And there's a really great opportunity here. And we'll kind of talk through this as we go through the presentation. But there's lots of opportunities to connect to ELA here. And especially if you are utilizing a teaming structure in your middle school or your junior high, or if you're a 6th grade that's attached to an elementary school, really think about those opportunities, because one of the things we have to have here is flexibility with students. And these are all tasks, again, that can be modified. They can all have flexible components. They don't necessarily even have to be graded. One of the things that we found great success with is, as we look at unpacking student thinking and the way that they respond to stimulus or to documents, giving them actionable feedback. And again, you don't have to do it with every single document, because I understand they have large numbers of students, right? When I was a social studies teacher, to have actionable feedback and write it back on 120 DBQs wasn't reality. But if you're really targeted here and you think about what you want the students to be able to produce and what you're looking for and what practices or skills you are looking to assess, really targeting and giving that specific feedback oftentimes will have as much value, if not more value, than a traditional grade. So we did color code these assignments, and we're just going to go very quickly through the key. Anything that's in orange is specifically kind of targeted towards our 6th graders. The green is 7th grade, and the 8th grade is teal. And again, before we jump into looking very quickly at the documents, just some resources for speaking to students about COVID-19. And these are also great resources to share out with our parents who are our partners now at home. Some of these articles are written for teachers, but some of them are also written for parents. This one by the National Association for School Psychologists, NASP, is excellent. It's thorough. It's continually updated. We have CDC guidance. We have a PBS guidance sheet. We have one from UNICEF. The Children's Hospital of Los Angeles also has a really kind of detailed way to unpack with students and has some of the questions embedded that students may be thinking, but may be concerned or uncomfortable asking. And so again, creating that safe space while recognizing the fact that this is impacting students differently. These are different resources that we would encourage you to utilize, and certainly feel free to share them with your administrators. I know that every school has support staff, your school psychologists, your guidance counselors working in different capacities. But this is, again, something that you can also share out with them as you delve into this conversation and think about how you want to unpack this with your students, even if you want to unpack it. In some cases, if your community is particularly hard hit, this may not be the moment to unpack this, but this may be something that you can hold on to and utilize at a different date.
Greg, I want to pop in and say one other thing.
Sure.
And that is, if your students struggle with understanding how history moves across time and place, if you pick the right variety or pick some of these documents, you can show them how we move from medieval time, we move to the early creation of the United States, we move through periods in US history right up to today. And it really provides you with a great snapshot across time and place. And you don't have to use every one to do it. You can cherry pick.
You can cherry pick, you can add to, oftentimes I think we are like, oh, these are materials, I have to abide by this. This is the rule. You are the experts on your own students. You know their strengths, you know their developmental levels, you know their educational levels, you know their reading level. You're going to see throughout this document, if you haven't looked at it already, there are multiple places where we're like, this is a really hard read. You need to go in there. For a student that is above grade level, this might be appropriate. For a student that's at grade level, you may have to adapt it. For a student that's below grade level, and I think Nancy will speak to this later as well, you may even want to use our 3 through 5 lessons and adapt those. So we really want to be flexible here. We want to be student-centered here. We also just created this to support all of you, because you're on the front lines, you're supporting kids in their learning in this very new and challenging way. Any materials or any resources, and this was an ask, this was a request from 6 through 8 teachers. So grade 6, it really focuses on comparison and contextualization, looking at medieval times. You can see the prompt questions here. We have the document, which is the Medieval Doctor. So here you'll see that there's an article here. It could be challenging for some students. This is part of a larger article from the BBC that has multiple pages to it. So if you wanted to delve deeper into the bubonic plague and give students some comparison for what things looked like in terms of treatment back then versus today, there's multiple pages, but this lands on the particular page that talks about quote unquote cures for the bubonic plague.
There is a lesson in grade 6 in SSELA that deals specifically with the plague. We were just trying to broaden looking at this, because some of the descriptions, to be honest, some of the descriptions and the pictures, when they were studying it theoretically, were less emotional than we think they would be today. So we focused it this way intentionally. But if you think your students can handle it, it's there in the SSELA curriculum.
Yeah, we also wanted to streamline this too for students, right? Thinking through an equity lens. I know some districts are just preparing packets and they're asking teachers to send links or to create documents. And so the idea being that you could click on this, you could print this out. If your school is having students pick up work in packets, if they don't have access to technology, that's something else that you could do as well. So this could just be printed out and created as a packet. Also, if you wanted to utilize it that way, you have follow-up questions. We then have kind of the comparison question with the modern doctor, allowing the students to look at the original image with that kind of traditional medieval bird mask that they would stuff the cloves or the incense into, looking at what we have today with the modern masks and respirators and goggles and protective gear, right, the PPE gear. And then going down to treatments for COVID-19, which again, this article is from Harvard, but it's actually written fairly accessibly. It kind of bullets it out for students. For a student that's at grade level reading for sixth grade or a little above, they can probably access it and make their way through it. For a student that is reading below, you may want to go in, copy and paste it, and then just source that information out to the students that way. Again, more follow-up questions. One of our other colleagues, Linda Brandon, created a great chart which can help students organize their ideas. And I'm not going to open it all the way up, but it compares the pandemics. So it compares the medieval doctor and the modern doctor, the plague, the treatments that are in place for both of them, how they look different, and how society is responding differently to both of them. And again, just like any of our other files, this file is view only. So you just open the file up, you go up to the corner, right? Same way that Google Slides works the same way. Click on File, go to make a copy of it. If you're utilizing Google Classroom, you can then actually share it out individually to each student, and they will be able to see it, and you'll be able to see it, and that's it. And then our writing prompts, if you want to talk about those briefly, Nancy.
Just 1 second. So you notice in the sixth grade one, it's really scaffolded. It's scaffolded first by some questions and then asking them to make a claim. And that's sort of the beginning level of having students construct a claim of this sort. As we go through the 7th and 8th grade lessons, you'll see that the claims are broader. And as we said before, there's absolutely no reason why you can't create a claim here and give it to the student and then have the student write in terms of agreeing or disagreeing. These are just ideas that we put out there for you to use it in a different way. Okay.
And so again, these were just ones that we recommend, and we're really saying this is resources to utilize, and we're always available. You know, it's business unusual here at SSELA, but we're all around and we are all accessible. So if you come up with a prompt and you want to run it by one of us and just say, hey, I just want somebody else to just kind of like talk through this. I've got a great idea. I've got a resource I want to share out. Or I looked at the documents you had and I found 4 or 5 better documents that I want to share out with the SSELA community. Reach out to us, email us, and we'll share our emails at the end. But again, the idea is that if we're doing something that works at a time when we're all kind of struggling to find things that work, we should share those good resources. Because again, this is a community and you all showing up here today is evidence of that. So we're gonna go down now to grade 7. Grade 7, we created 2 of them. And again, they can be adapted any way you want to. Nancy spoke briefly to these. So the first one is an excerpt from a longer text by Dr. Mark Bratton. It talks about smallpox and the conquest of Mexico. It relates to the Columbian Exchange. It's got good data actually embedded in it and talks about you know, the number of Native people that were reduced, indigenous people that were reduced as a result of the influx of European diseases that were brought over through trade and conquest and exploration. The source is here. If you do want to go to the source and use a longer version of it, that's there as well. And then we have everybody's favorite Columbian Exchange chart, which I'm pretty sure every single 7th grade teacher in New York State uses. I know when I taught New York State, 7th grade social studies, this is the one that I utilize, right? Everybody always kind of points out the skull and crossbones over here and the different kind of diseases that were brought over, you know, purposely, right? Not on purpose, but also purposely, with reason, through the Columbian Exchange, and were used as a biological weapon. Document 3 talks about the Native American population chart. And again, students, you can even have them kind of look at this population chart and then refer back to the earlier document, because there are different statistics in each, because it's not, you know, known, right? We have all of these scholars who are taking a best guess in terms of the number of Native people that were impacted by disease, but you could even draw a comparison to that. You could ask students to think about which one they think is more reliable, why they think it's more reliable, some of that higher level thinking. And then, of course, there's follow-up questions. And then we have document 4, which is a world trade map, which is by the UN. And that, again, connects the idea of the Columbian Exchange was important. It was powerful. It was an economic driver, but it also brought disease and death to people. You know, now thinking about trade today, right, we always think about trade as being solely positive, but we know that trade and that travel was one of the ways that COVID-19 was spread. And so we obviously cannot step away from trade. Our society, our culture, our economics on a global scale are built around trade. But you can also use this to engage students in thinking about the future going forward. How might travel and trade look different with the idea being that we don't want to have repeat pandemics. And again, we're not trying to scare students here, but we're trying to empower them. And a seventh grader can think about these things. You know, obviously, again, if you live in a community that's been, you know, disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, you may want to do a much shallower dive here. But students do need to be aware of this. They're seeing this information. They're seeing the briefings from the president. They're hearing information from the CDC. They're getting other information from the WHO. We need to try to contextualize that for them and help them make sense of that, because otherwise they're going to try to fill in the blanks. And that's where fear oftentimes comes from, you know, us inserting information that may or may not be accurate into our own understandings of what we see around us.
And I just want to point out real quickly, that is a complex map. Visually, it's a complex map. So I think there's value to working with students with documents or with maps in particular that are that complex to help them disaggregate some of the information and then answer those questions that they see below.
Absolutely. The next one is again a document that relates to that map. You could use document 5 in conjunction with document 4. This is an article from the World Economic Forum, which was, you know, partially supported by UN data, looking at global trade and the idea of a global recession, how much trade is going to go down. So again, you can have students step into the economics practice from the framework, talk a little bit about economics. And even though we don't technically talk oftentimes about current trade, right, in 7th grade, it's a great way to tie in thinking about mercantilism, thinking about the Columbian Exchange, those times that we do talk about global trade in 7th grade, and then comparing it and bringing it and giving it meaning for students today.
You know, it's even, we don't have a document that speaks to this, but an interesting conversation to have with them is how they have exchanged money, how they've paid for things, how they have exchanged, if, you know, if they've done any takeout, how we are exchanging back and forth with one another during this pandemic, and how that's so different from any way we have interacted with people when we were, you know, purchasing things today.
And we have another great chart right here from Linda Brandon, again, comparing in the impact of the Columbian Exchange on Europeans and Amerindians, and also looking at modern day trade. Once you make a copy of these, they are all editable, so you can make it work for whatever you are doing. You can adapt it and, again, make it fit your personal needs. And then, of course, we have the writing prompts and compelling questions. And I can't encourage you enough. I was fortunate enough when I was a 7th grade social studies and special ed teacher, I had fabulous ELA teachers, and just having their lens, the way that they wanted students to construct claims. And at a time where we're all trying to figure out how we can get students to continue to grow, you know, without overwhelming them, thinking about ways that, you know, if you have an ELA teacher that's working on writing claims with students right now, and you've got, you know, this kind of content that you want to throw out there, I mean, we really want to think about killing 2 birds with 1 stone. It's going to make it easier for you to give actionable feedback to the student. It's going to be easier for your teacher partner, the ELA teacher, to give feedback to students. And it's also going to reduce the stress on the students because they're still getting value. They're still getting, you know, the benefit of ELA instruction and social studies instruction, but they're going to see that synergy and that crossover. So before we move on, because we're about at the halfway point here, just want to really open it up to any questions. So again, if you want to just use the hand raise function or comments, feel free to just hit the hand raise function in the participant box, or feel free to pop something into the chat. And again, we are going to move through the rest of the documents fairly quickly because we do want to open it up to any of your needs, any of your thoughts, or any of your wonderings or curiosities. All right, so we'll move on. But again, just feel free to pop in at any time. So the second 7th grade option, again, Nancy made reference to this before. This is comparing and contrasting government and leaders' actions. So thinking about leadership, thinking about how leadership is one of the main drivers in the 7th grade framework, how it shows up in multiple key ideas, how when we think about the personalities that emerge, right, whether they be a positive leader like George Washington, negative leaders like Andrew Jackson, thinking about how leadership oftentimes defines a time period, and looking at Lincoln's action, looking at Washington's actions here, and looking at modern action in terms of government. So the first document, U.S. government response overview, videos, visuals, and descriptions. This comes right from coronavirus.gov. Down below, we have a more challenging article from the Department of Health and Human Services. Again, a great article, though, that you could delve into and you could pick multiple parts out of, that you could share with students, that you could bullet information out to students. And again, provide some contextualization here, because students, we know, are online. They can access all of this information. We're just showing you where they could be going. You know, if a student goes to Google and types in coronavirus information, when I did that, this came up as number 1 and this came up as number 2. So the most logical place for us to then, you know, provide students with information from is going to be where they might be accessing it from already. But I will tell you that they may be accessing it and not fully comprehending all of it. Going down to document number 3, and we do have the follow-up questions. We have the letter from General Washington to Dr. Shippen talking about smallpox inoculations. And students do always obviously enjoy reading through here. You know, there are the abbreviations, right? The colonial abbreviations, which they always like to point out and they always like to see. But again, this is the actual text from that letter from Washington to Shippen, sent to the Morristown headquarters. And then we linked to Mount Vernon's really nice repository of information about George Washington's actions to combat smallpox. And lots of follow-up questions here, which can be adapted to your own needs. And then we have writing prompts right here. So again, leadership changes over time, looking at similarities and differences. You may be past, obviously, looking at the Revolutionary War at this time, but many students gravitate towards that. So if you want to just kind of circle back around with students, you know, think about kind of the highlights of the year. The Revolutionary War tends to be something that does stick with our students. We tend to spend a lot of time around the key ideas connected to that. So this would be a great place to revisit that and talk about leadership today, how it looks differently. You know, do leaders always think about the entire population? Do they think about certain parts of the population? What are the motivations for leaders to act? Do leaders act selfishly or unselfishly? You could unpack all of those questions with them with the resources we have or by adding your own. And then a great question that Nancy generated that's really, really broad, and one of my colleagues is actually using with her students right now is, have epidemics and pandemics brought out the best or worst in us throughout history? So if you really wanted to leave this really wide open and you wanted students to explore their own thoughts and their own needs at this time, they could, you know, as, you know, drawing on their own experiences, think about what they're seeing around them and make that claim, and then use the evidence above, use what's happening to them, their personal experiences, right? So there's validation in that, and talk about whether or not this is bringing out the best or worst in people. We'll pause for a second for any questions before we head into 8th grade. And we did just break up the pages so that it did not look like one giant document, because again, we all know how overwhelming that can be. So Nancy made reference before, so this is 8th grade, to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. It is not specifically, you know, described in detail in the framework, but it's alluded to. It's connected to World War I. It's connected to those ideas, again, of examining the practices and thinking about the economic impact in 1918. And here we are almost 100 years later. And there just are striking similarities given the kind of 102 years between both events and how it's going to play out. From a scientific standpoint, so if you wanted to jump into science, you know, epidemiologists are using the 1918 flu pandemic to try to, you know, anticipate how COVID-19 is going to behave and react. So it's interesting, and you can point that out to students that, you know, data from 102 years ago is still really relevant to our understanding of how this pandemic is playing out and how it's going to impact and shape us. We have a question from Janelle about the fevers of Philadelphia and New Orleans. So what I would say, Janelle, I don't know if you're referring to the yellow fever, that epidemics that used to occur in Philadelphia and how the government used to move itself, which would be like a 7th grade topic. But you could certainly bring in any of those resources, because one of the things that we can do is we can, again, we don't want students to say, oh, this is just kind of old hat, this is normal, because we're in really, you know, not usual times. But students may better understand what's happening if they see that this is something that's cyclical, right? That pandemics and epidemics do occur from time to time. We were lucky enough with SARS that it didn't impact us in the same way that it impacted Asia a few years ago. We were lucky with the Ebola outbreak in Africa that it didn't impact us in the same way here in the United States, but that these things do occur from time to time all over the world. This is just hitting us very differently because it's at our doorstep. So you could certainly make those great connections. And I know that in John Adams, for example, so if you wanted to share with the students, you know, in 7th grade, John Adams, there's a whole scene where John Adams is talking to George Washington about escaping Philadelphia before yellow fever hits, you know, for its yearly outbreak in the city. So you could certainly utilize that. Some of that stuff is on YouTube, but look for other resources to incorporate. But again, be creative here.
I am not in any way an expert, but we do have someone here who is very keyed into young adults literature. And I would be very interested to know if there were any young adult books that were written through the perspective of a young person living through this era of the Spanish flu. Because the interesting thing for students, and Donna, if you know of any, or if you think, gee, I'll look around for one of those, I think that would be a great addition to this lesson. But I think one of the things kids struggle with is when they study something like this in history and they've never experienced it, they find it almost impossible to believe it occurred or connect with it. And now they can really, when they study this flu, they can really connect with, wow, what it must have been like back then. And we will get through this just as they did, and life went on. I see Janelle's made another suggestion here.
Any thoughts on that though, Donna? Can you think off the top of your head of any text that people might be able to anchor to this?
There's a book called Pox that is written around the Revolutionary time, and I think it gets at smallpox, and it also talks a little bit about yellow fever. That's one. I've seen some for 6th graders where they do more of an overview kind of thing during the 1600s when the Black Plague comes back. That has some also usefulness. But how about if I play around a little bit and try to put some sort of list together and send it to you guys, and then it can be shared out?
Outstanding. We'll send it out to the listserv. That's perfect. And
Yeah,
Jennifer actually,
great.
yep. And Jennifer actually just shared Fever 1793 focuses on the Philly yellow fever from a 14-year-old perspective. So another terrific resource. And, you know, at a time where publishers are being super flexible and are being good partners, these may be texts that you can find online. You know, Audible is offering a lot of their texts. So thinking about struggling readers, they may be able to access it and listen to some of these things. So this would be something that we could dig into, but it sounds like Donna's willing to kind of take that on, and we appreciate it. And what we'll do is when we send out the next SSELA listserv email next week, I'll take all of your suggestions in here, I'll link them, and then what I'll also do is I'll take any of Donna's recommendations, and we can put together a nice list so people have nice jumping off points, especially if they want to work with their ELA partners in this work.
I think this is a great exercise for students too, because they are just about at the point where the novelty of not going to school is starting to hit home. And I do think they really want to talk about how this, you know, is not the life they envisioned and the school experience they envisioned. So I think it would be great for them to have something to compare it to historically.
100%. So again, same kind of format, documents. We chunk these out a little bit more with follow-up questions. So, you know, we have a Spanish flu hospital. There's a lot that you can explore there. You can look at the way that the government kind of took, you know, if you want to talk about socialized medicine, people who may have normally not had access to medicine or hospital care in 1918, you saw that expanded as the government, not only here in the United States, but different global governments really expanded their healthcare systems to try to contain it, looking at illness as not being an individual problem here, but being a societal problem, and the way that they opened up these flu hospitals, including this one from the US. great sign here, Spanish flu warning sign. And again, it connects to World War I because it talks about the Navy Yard. It talks about the war in Europe. It talks about not spitting, right? Because again, our understanding is starting to evolve at this time in terms of the transmission of these diseases. Obviously, you could also say, you know, they're talking about spitting here. How has our understanding of how, you know, disease, you know, is spread changed from that? And again, if you want to partner with your science teacher on this too, another great jumping off point. And yesterday, Nancy and I were talking, and we even said, this is a good opportunity for math. So if you jump into some of these documents, if you go back and, you know, as an 8th grade teacher or as a 7th grade teacher, as a 6th grade teacher, if you want to look at that modern global trade map, it goes to a landing page, which is full of statistics. And if you had a math teacher who really wanted to dive into this with you, they could create some really meaningful math-related statistics activities, which would give students some sense of what's actually going on and make meaning of all the numbers that they're hearing thrown around on podcasts and on TV and in conversations among the adults that are around them. And then just a great image from history.com. So this talks about the late 1920s, I think it's 1928, flu outbreak. This is from London. But looking at the personal protective gear here, talking about the understanding of how disease was spread then. And if you actually click on this picture in your own document, it takes you to a repository of additional images from throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, looking at different outbreaks of disease.
And the controversy surrounding, can the government make us wear these face masks? I already see comments starting to pop up. Well, what the challenge of, well, what's going to happen if some Americans don't wear them? It just cracked me up because it reminded me, okay, world, now you know what happens when we try to impose a rule in school and kids want to challenge it. But it's a great conversation for kids. Can the government actually impose these kinds of restrictions on us? Yes, they can.
And then it jumps to the modern pictures. So here we have one, this is from Canada, but I thought that this was one of the best ones I saw in terms of the way that the beds are lined up. You know, I also wanted to make sure it didn't show specifically any patients because we don't want to trigger students or frighten students any more than they already are, but just looking at the biohazard suits. And again, if you're teaching 8th grade and you wanted to talk a little bit about how technology has progressed, you could even jump back to the 6th grade lesson and say, hey, we're going to jump back to 6th grade for a second because we're operating in unusual times. We don't necessarily have to always feel like we are, you know, within our normal structures. So if this is a good opportunity for you to go back and review and jump back to medieval times and you want to look at that with your students, utilize the open space that you have to do that as long as you feel comfortable doing it. Of course, the empty shelves, right? I'm sure we all have our experiences with this. You know, if I was teaching this, I would probably talk about the fact that I stayed up till 1:30 the other night to try to get on Peapod so that I could get a Stop and Shop delivery, and how, you know, things that I took for granted in the past, like shopping at a grocery store, thinking about scarcity, again, tying into economics, how this has, you know, exacerbated those things. So certainly another great way to connect, you know, the past, the present, and our own personal experiences. Students also want to hear how we're feeling and how we're managing this as well. So if you feel comfortable sharing that in that space, there's also real value socially and emotionally in that. The door warning signs. So, you know, talking about restrictions from certain countries, and again, alluding to what Nancy said, what can the government do? What can organizations do? We know in the past there were issues where certain groups of people, where jingoism took place, where restrictions took place, where anti-immigrant actions took place. You could connect that to this as well, but the idea being that the intention here is to protect people. So does this go far enough? Does this not go far enough? Where's that line between individual rights and liberty and protecting society as a whole? And we'll go down to the last document, which is a great regional document talking about teachers printing 3D masks. And again, the idea of individuals stepping up and going down to our jumping off question. Scroll down real quick. Compelling question being, again, the idea, have epidemics and pandemics brought out the best or worst of us throughout history? So again, looking at those documents, thinking about how people responded in the past, they might look at document 1 and say, wow, that brought out the government, thinking about people and centering healthcare and providing healthcare to everybody, even the poor. And looking at document 5 and saying, oh, people are panicking here and they're acting selfishly. And does somebody really need to buy 50 bottles of hand sanitizer? Now it's unavailable maybe for people who need it. So lots of opportunities here to think about the good and the bad that's kind of manifested itself in the recent weeks and recent months. So that is really it in terms of the lessons themselves. And then we just popped in a couple of additional resources down here below.
So Greg,
Yep, go ahead.
Before you finish that, and then before we open up discussion.
Sure. So we have Newsela or Newsela, whichever way you pronounce it. There's great resources there. They're creating updated articles, and they range from, again, bias against Chinese restaurants and communities to how school might look in the future because of this, and they kind of run the broad gamut of that. There's some really scientific ones that talk about, the treatment and the actions the government are taking, and some of those may be more accessible. Newsela also does a really nice job of leveling things, but again, think about your learners. And you may have to create, here's the article in itself, but I also created, a bulleted note sheet, kind of like what Nancy created for us today. That might be a nice companion for a lot of those. The New York Times lesson, which helped us with our 8th grade lesson, but has lots of other great photos from the Century of Epidemics. And then this one, which I may actually open up because it is just fascinating. Again, thinking about how you're going to frame this and present this, one of the things that students, again, struggle with is trying to understand how this fits into the broader history of pandemics, what COVID-19 looks like compared to the bubonic plague. But this is a really great, and it's continually updated. So it's from Visual Capitalist, and it actually goes all the way back, right, past the plague of Justinian, right, going back to the 500s. And it creates these virtual representations of the number of people that were killed in each plague. And again, you have to be careful here thinking about how you're going to unpack this because death is very real and loss is very real in our communities here. But if you're trying to give students some lay of the land, this may be a powerful visual for that. And it goes all the way down to modern day. So you can see there's the Spanish flu right there, 40 to 50 million. Especially for our visual learners, this may be powerful. There we have HIV and AIDS, Asian flu, SARS, and then COVID-19, which again is updated on a daily basis. So this is a nice visual. And I don't know if I would necessarily use this now, but as we teach this going forward in the future as a current event, especially in 8th grade, or if you're a 6th grade teacher or a 7th grade teacher, when you're teaching about the plague in 6th grade, or you're teaching about smallpox in Washington and the inoculations in 7th grade, and you want to draw it into a current event, this is going to be a great document where students are going to be like, you know what, 2 years down the road, I lived through that. I can make sense of that. I feel comfortable delving into that. There's a great visual that it gives them some context in the broader historical frame. So go ahead, Nancy, and then we'll open it up to questions for everybody.
Okay, I did want to point out that the grade 3 lesson deals with human rights in general. So if you want to talk about this sort of divide between, well, this, although we know this is changing, this is an illness that predominantly hits weakened people, physically weakened or older people. And there is a conversation that goes on sometime, well, if we have to sacrifice those people for the greater good of the economy, that's necessary. How does that factor into human rights? If you want to go that route, there's some good information even in the grade 3 lesson. Grade 4 deals with sharing responsibility among state and federal governments. It came up again in 7th grade, and it is completely laced through this current conversation of whose responsibility it is for testing right now we see going on. And then grade 5 deals with comparative approaches to the pandemic in the Western Hemisphere, Canada, the United States, and I think it was, I don't remember now, was it Mexico or I don't remember what country. But
it was Canada, the United States, and Mexico.
But now the issue of COVID-19 is really starting to percolate in Latin America. It's just hitting there. And so there's also a conversation of what impact is that going to have on the United States and the migration that we see move back and forth legally or illegally and through trade. Is that going to pose a new threat for us? So those topics were great. I would like to start this off with one question, and I really am curious.
Nancy, before you do your question, Donna just has her hand up, so I just wanted we'll jump to Donna, and then we'll come right back to you.
Okay.
There's two things I think about in looking at the materials that you've gathered together and the things that you're talking about. One is enduring issues. You've got a number of them that you can choose from and work on. And if you're trying to get at some of that, whether it's the impact of disease or cultural diffusion or the role of government and the impact of government in various scenarios, I think those are topics that kids can relate to, that they would talk about. I also see that the conversation about states' rights is there. 7th graders really struggle with the government unit. And you have to keep revisiting it. And I think it ends up coming back to 8th grade again if you really want them to understand it. But the states' rights issue related to who's responsible for doing what and the conversations that are going back and forth between the federal government and the state governments and then local governments, I think are important ones to address with kids and looking at those kinds of things and who's responsible. So just some things to think about as you're trying to figure out how you want to address it based on your community.
Excellent. Go ahead, Nancy. You wanted to pose kind of a question or a thought?
I did. I wanted to ask a question about how most of you, some of you, any of you are delivering your social studies instruction. And are any of you working with kids in teams and having conversations? Or is it mostly they work on Google, like through Google Docs, and they communicate back and forth? Has anybody tried doing like a Zoom meeting or team and having live conversations with students?
And again, you can share that in the chat if you want to, but it would be great to hear some actual experiences. Excellent. Go ahead, Jennifer. Let me unmute you. There you go.
Hi, everybody. I work in Dobbs Ferry, and this week we started live teaching, quote unquote, where we meet with, we have 2.5 hours spread out over the week where we meet with students. How we do that is up to our discretion. So I was meeting with like a class or 2 classes combined, because not everybody comes to the meetings, and deliver some content that way. And then just followed up with, work, like you were saying, Nancy, through Google Classroom.
Right.
We are a 1-to-1 district, so kids starting in 6th grade, which is what I teach, they get a Chromebook that they can bring home. So that's allowed us to have this kind of an opportunity.
So one of the things I was thinking about in terms of strategies that might up the ante is if you did divide the kids into teams, even if they had conversations amongst themselves online. One could be a group of members of a medical community, another could be a group of economists, another could be a group of policymakers, and they could take any one of those prompts or take one of those issues and then formulate their reaction to something or their point of view, and then come together. Even you can do it live or you can do it through text, how they perceive that issue through those different lenses, because that really gets at the different standards of social studies. And then another one was to ask students to react to a particular article through different perspectives. And they can either choose the perspectives or you can, kind of give them a choice of perspectives to react with.
And I think that's an important point that Nancy hit on. We're trying to create authentic tasks, right? High quality tasks that, aren't just history based, right? We want them to be social studies tasks. And so thinking about the idea that there should be a practice embedded somewhere in there, there should be some content in there, but oftentimes we forget about the fact that you can use those different lenses. So look at the 5 standards, right? Think about having them combined. They could do standard 1 and 2, thinking as either one of those as a historian. You could have them think as a geographer, right? Looking at those maps. They can look at as an economist. If they're looking from the medical idea or the idea of community good, you could bring that into the civics. So there's just lots of different opportunities, or the idea of being a social scientist. There's lots of opportunities for intersection there. And again, this is a time to be really creative. We want to honor and support and care for our students' needs. We want to center their social emotional health as much as we want to take care and practice self-care for ourselves. But this is a time where you can really pull out some interesting things from the playbook and try them and see if they bring new meaning to students, see if they help you to foster that connection either among your students or between you and your students at a time where you're not in a room with them. And that's a key component of education, right? We know that student connection is one of the main drivers in terms of how they're going to learn. So making it be relevant and important to them and having that connection with you in some way, whether it be through feedback or whether it be through some kind of connection in terms of how you're communicating. And thank you for sharing that, Jennifer, again, in terms of what your district's doing. It's powerful to hear.
I know we're almost running out of time. We've talked about issues that I think really connect to the framework, but another topic that I see it's popping up more and more, and they're really starting to get nervous about it, is the issue of sports, interscholastic sports not taking place, and how this is going to impact their immediate future in going to school, and also how this is going to affect college students and the job market.
We have a question, Nancy.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's all good. You were talking about athletes. I coach lax at Westlake High School, so our athletes are really like shaken up about it. Like, we had a senior that was gonna break a record, and he won't be able to do that. It affects the juniors also, because this is like a big year for scholarships and recruiting for next year. So what we've been doing, we've been staying in contact with them. Like Monday we'll post like a workout, like an upper body workout. Wednesday we'll post something like sports related, and then Friday what we've been doing is like a team activity. Mm-hmm. So what did we do? We posted like a picture of us with like a quote. We did like a push-up challenge. I think this week we're gonna do who's our favorite athlete and why. We'll post like a little video. So, just the athletes are, like for me, I played football in high school. Like, I couldn't tell you what I'd be going through if my football season got canceled. So like,
yeah,
some of these kids, sports is what keeps them out of trouble. So for that,
100%,
a big thing,
And validating those concerns. And again, I think we can also jump off to that and think about our middle schoolers is we often engage in conversations about non-social studies topics with our students. So as social studies educators, there's nothing wrong with reaching out and saying, what's an activity you did this week not related to school? Because again, leveraging relationships and keeping those relationships alive, taking a video of yourself, walking in your backyard or walking down the street and just say, hey, this is Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. I'm just checking in with everybody, seeing how everybody's doing, miss all of you. I mean, that's going to have real value here. So don't always think that we have to just operate from a place where we're delivering direct instruction. We operate at PNW BOCES. We have an online high school. And it's all fostered on communication and relationships. That's the foundation. And then the instruction sits on top of that. So use your best tricks, right? Use your best methodology. Try to keep connected with kids and try to keep those relationships going because that's what's going to sustain their learning. They're not going to learn if they feel disconnected. They're not going to access the tasks that you pose for them if they don't feel connected. How connected they feel to you may ultimately determine how much they access and how much they're willing to engage in learning. So I think that those were all solid points. And certainly for our high schoolers, this has hit them in an entirely different way. And it's tragic. It's definitely tragic. So we've come up to 12 o'clock. We'll leave the room space open. I want to thank Donna and Nancy and Jessica and really all of you and all of the information that you shared. One of the beautiful things about Zoom is it's going to catalog everything that was in the group chat. And I know Donna is going to dig into those YA books that may be applicable here. And we're going to share all those out. But this is what it's about, folks. It's about community. So I'm going to share my email address right now. And if any of you have any ongoing thoughts, if you put this into play in any way in the coming days or weeks, and you have reflections or you have additional thoughts or you come across a great resource, you know, our listserv goes out to 7,000 educators. And so again, there's that idea of the collective hive mind, there's that idea of crowdsourcing, and there's the idea of our unified strength. And we just kind of continue, you know, looking forward to working with you. Hopefully we'll be back in school and everybody will be healthy and safe sooner rather than later. But if this is the long haul, we're in this long haul together. And I would leave it with Nancy and Donna if you have any final thoughts that you would like to add.
I would just like to say if, you know, if you have any ideas or you have any questions, please come back. Yeah, I don't know how to add my email, Craig, but we can
do it for you. I got you.
Yeah, we are here. And if you want to keep the conversation going, I don't even want to say this, but if this continues on and you think that you'd like to reconvene, we're here.
Yeah, I mean, we are happy to spend time. And, you know, the one nice silver lining that's going to come out of this, and I hate to use that term silver lining, but the idea being that we are all going to continue going forward as a group, as SSELA. You know, these webinars are going to become regular things. They'll probably be bi-monthly, I would say, at the minimum, but it's just going to be a nice way that even once we're back to hopefully business as usual, whenever that is, that we can stay in touch. And I think that there is real power in putting faces to names, because I recognize a lot of you from emails and from phone calls. And it's nice to actually see who people are, see their space, and the fact that you gave your time today to participate in this is great. Any last thoughts, Donna?
No, and I'll put my email up as well. I'm happy to take ideas if people have other things, so that we're putting that book list together. If you've got something you think I should take a look at, that's great to help. And I hope everybody does well.
Yeah.
I know this is never going to become the only way we deliver instruction, but if you are a dedicated teacher, like I know many of you are, like all of you are.
I mean, you're here, so you are.
Here, exactly. We just can't give up. We have to keep trying to find ways to reach out and engage students and give them a meaningful educational opportunity, because for many of them, that's the brightest part of their day.
Absolutely. So again, thank you all for participating today. I'll keep the room open for a couple minutes if anybody wants to stick around and ask any specific questions. Otherwise, wish you all good health, wish you and yours continued safety and peace in these times. And we'll see all of you real soon again. So be well. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Lewis is a face. He's not an eye.
I'm not a hacker. I'm not a hacker. Don't worry.
Thank you. Thanks, Lewis.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody.
Take care.
Take care.